Welcome to session 35 of our class on the conquest. We're in 2 Kings chapters 16 and 17. An English proverb says, "Consider well who you are, where you came from, what you do, and where you are going." The first two considerations were easily answered in both Israel and Judah, for both nations would have said, "We are God's chosen people, descendants of our father Abraham." As for the third question, both kings would have to admit, "We do what our wicked predecessors did." King Ahaz of Judah didn't follow the godly example of his ancestor David, and Hoshea, king of Israel, imitated the wicked kings that ruled before him. They were free to make these decisions, but they were not free to change the consequences of their decisions. Which brings us to our fourth question: where are you going? For both rulers, God's answer was clear. You and your people are plunging rapidly toward judgment and ruin. Solomon's words were about to be proved in both kingdoms. He said in Proverbs 14:34, "Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people." First, we have in 2 Kings 16, 1 through 20, Judah, a compromising nation. Ahaz was the son of Jotham, a good king, and the father of Hezekiah, a very good king. But he himself was not a godly man, or even a good man. Instead of discovering and doing the will of God, Ahaz imitated the wicked kings of Israel and even the pagan practices of Assyria. He even adopted the horrible worship practices of the pagans and sacrificed his son to a pagan god, Baal or Molech, a practice that was clearly prohibited in the law of Moses. Each Jewish son was to be redeemed by a sacrifice and therefore belonged to the Lord. How could a son who belonged to God be sacrificed to an idol? But Ahaz was a compromiser both in his religious practices and his political leadership. Pekah, the king of Israel, and Rezin, king of Syria, wanted Ahaz to join with them in opposing Assyria. But Ahaz refused because he was pro-Assyrian. In fact, he trusted Assyria instead of trusting the Lord. In retaliation, Syria and Israel planned to remove Ahaz from the throne and put their own puppet king in his place. But the Lord protected David's throne, even though Ahaz didn't deserve it. You can read more about this in Isaiah chapters 7, 8, and 9. According to 2 Chronicles 28, verses 5 through 8, it was the Lord who brought these two kings against Judah to punish Ahaz for his sins. Pekah and Rezin did a great deal of damage to Judah, but they weren't able to take Jerusalem. One of the sons of Ahaz was killed, along with two key officers. The invading armies killed thousands of soldiers and took thousands of prisoners of war. It looked like Israel was going to swallow up Judah. The Lord raised up a prophet in Israel who warned the Samaritan army that by taking these people of Judah as prisoners, Israel was breaking God's law and inviting God's judgment. After all, the people of Judah and the people of Samaria were part of one family, the family of Abraham. The prophet Obed, not the same man as in chapter 15 and verse 8, pointed out three sins the army of Israel committed. First, they were in a rage against the people of Judah and captured and killed them indiscriminately. Second, they planned to make slaves out of their own brothers and sisters, and this was contrary to God's law. In doing these things, they showed no fear of the Lord, and therefore were asking for him to judge them. Yes, God was angry with Judah, but there was danger that he would become angry at Israel for the way they treated Judah. After Obed's message, some of the leaders in Israel stood and affirmed what he had said, and urged the army not to sin against the Lord and their brothers and sisters. A remarkable thing happened. The people accepted God's message. They repented and changed their treatment of the prisoners. The Israelites not only fed and clothed them and gave special help to the injured and feeble, but the soldiers even returned the loot that they had taken from Judah. This was an instance of being good Samaritans on a national level. And it reminds us of Elisha's kindness to the Syrian soldiers who came to capture him. When the prisoners, with the spoils of battle, arrived back in Judah, they were living witnesses of the goodness of the Lord. This remarkable event carried another message to Judah. The time would come when the Babylonians would invade the land and take thousands of captives away to Babylon. This experience with the kingdom of Israel was somewhat of a dress rehearsal, you might say, for the people of Judah. But Babylon wouldn't treat them as the Israelites did. Most of the Jewish captives would die in Babylon, and after 70 years, only a feeble remnant would return to rebuild the temple and try to establish the nation again. Does the Lord still chasten nations today as he did in ancient days? The Jewish people, of course, belonged to a covenant nation, even though it was now divided into two kingdoms, and they were responsible to obey the covenant of the Lord. But what about the Gentile nations that have no covenant relationship with God? The prophet Amos makes it clear that God knows the sins of the Gentile nations and holds them accountable. God never gave his law to the Gentiles, but the demands of that law are written in the hearts of all people. So the disobedient Gentiles are guilty before the Lord. As you read the Old Testament, you find God judging Sodom and Gomorrah, Egypt, the Gentile nations in and around Canaan, and even Babylon. However, because the Jews knew the true and living God and had his law, they were even more accountable. How tragic that apostate Israel and not enlightened Judah showed concern about obeying the message of God, or did not show concern about obeying the message of God. Judah had the temple, the law, and the priesthood, but they didn't have the Lord. Psalm 33:12 said, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." And we would add that when we said that Gentiles were never given the law of Moses, we would add that we are now, all peoples, both Jew and Gentile, supposed to live under the new covenant, since the old covenant has been taken away. Not only did Israel and Syria attack Judah, but God also brought the Edomites and the Philistines against Jerusalem. Ahaz sent word to the king of Assyria to come and help him. He called himself Tiglath-Pileser's servant and son, a strange posture for a descendant of David to take before a pagan ruler. To encourage the Assyrian king even more, Ahaz took wealth from the temple, the palace, and the princes, and sent him a gift. Actually, Ahaz made Judah a vassal nation under the control and protection of Assyria. Ahaz had no living faith in the Lord, and he put his trust in the army of Assyria instead, and this cost him dearly. Indeed, Assyria did defeat Syria, but then Tiglath-Pileser summoned his son and servant to Damascus to give an account of himself and to receive orders. Gone were the days when the kings of Judah and their armies were feared by the nations. King Uzziah had tried to meddle with the ministry in the temple, and the Lord gave him leprosy. But Urijah the high priest did nothing to prevent the king from taking the things from the temple. He did anything the king commanded, even if it meant disobeying the law of Moses. We aren't sure whether copying the pagan altar was totally the idea of Ahaz, or whether the king of Assyria commanded it. Perhaps Tiglath-Pileser wanted this altar in the Jewish temple to remind the king and people of Judah that they were now under the authority of Assyria. Ahaz was not devoted to the faithful worship of Jehovah, so it's likely that this altar was copied simply to satisfy his pride. He would have a royal altar like the one in Damascus. Consequently, the God-designed altar of the Lord was shoved to one side. All of this is a picture of what often happens in Christian ministries today. Somebody sees something out in the world that would, quote-unquote, fit into the Lord's work, such as instrumental music or women leading in the church, and the church starts to imitate the world. Moses was commanded to make the tabernacle according to what God showed him on the mount. And likewise, the temple was constructed according to the plans God gave to David. The Jews didn't appoint a building committee and vote on the design that God gave Moses. But today, the church is becoming so like the world that it's getting difficult to tell them apart. Ahaz thought that the Lord would be pleased with sacrifices offered on this magnificent new altar, but he was wrong. The Lord didn't want sacrifice alone. He also wanted obedience. And Ahaz worshiped the gods of the heathen nations. The religious novelties in churches today may excite and entertain the people, but they don't edify the church, nor do they exalt the Lord. The worship becomes theater, entertainment, and a performance, and the congregation becomes an audience. The measure of all this is not the glory of God, but the applause of the people. But replacing God's altar with a pagan altar was just the beginning. King Ahaz also remodeled the laver and the 10 movable stands that held the 10 basins for preparing sacrifices. Apparently, he needed the precious metal for his own purposes, so he took it from the Lord. But to please the king of Assyria, Ahaz had to remove his own royal entryway to the temple, as well as the royal canopy that he had placed in the temple. Tiglath-Pileser was now in charge, not King Ahaz. However, the king could never have made all these changes without the cooperation of Urijah the high priest. When King Uzziah tried to rebel against the word of the Lord and enter the temple, the high priest Azariah with 80 other priests successfully withstood him, but Urijah and his priests compromised, disobeyed the law of Moses, and gave in to their king. Once compromise begins, it continues to grow, and all that it takes for evil to triumph is for weak people like Urijah to let leaders have their way. Ahaz not only replaced the altar and removed metal from the furnishings, but he finally took all the vessels for himself, closed the doors of the temple, and set up altars in the streets of Jerusalem. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 6, "Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough?" Once we allow worldliness to get into the church, it will quietly grow, pollute the fellowship, and eventually take over. It was not until the reign of his son Hezekiah that the temple Ahaz had defiled was reopened and sanctified for ministry. 2 Chronicles chapter 29. When Ahaz died, he was buried in Jerusalem, but not in the royal tombs. In this, he joined Jehoram, Joash, and Uzziah. In addition, Manasseh would later join them in chapter 33 of 2 Chronicles. The unbelief and unfaithfulness of Ahaz did great damage to the kingdom of Judah, some of which his son Hezekiah would be able to repair. Next, we see Israel, a captive nation, in 2 Kings 17. Hoshea was the last ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel, because in 722 BC, as we have noticed, the Assyrians invaded the land, deported many of the citizens, and repopulated Israel with Gentile peoples from lands Assyria had conquered. The kingdom of Israel became Samaria, named after the capital city. God had given his people so many blessings, and now those blessings would fall into the hands of Assyria and Babylon. The Jews had a living Lord, but they replaced him with dead idols. Their wealthy land was confiscated by enemy nations. The people were taken captive, and eventually Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. God, in His mercy, preserved a faithful remnant so a light would remain shining and He could fulfill the promises He had made to His people. In the first 5 verses of this chapter, we see that Israel lost its leader. Hoshea had assassinated Pekah and seized the throne of Israel. Tiglath-Pileser had died, and Shalmaneser V was now king of Assyria, and Hoshea gave homage to him and brought him tribute. However, Hoshea secretly made a treaty with Egypt to enlist them to fight for Israel and help them break the Assyrian yoke. Ever since Abraham fled to Egypt to escape a famine and only got himself and his wife into trouble, various Jewish leaders have vainly looked to Egypt for help. When Shalmaneser discovered the plot, he took Hoshea prisoner and left the throne of Israel empty. In 725, Shalmaneser began to besiege Samaria, but then he died or was killed, and his leading general Sargon II took over. The siege lasted 3 years, and in 722 the city capitulated. Assyria had already taken the tribes east of the Jordan, so now they possessed everything but Judah, and that would fall to Babylon. As we have seen, Assyria's policy was to relocate conquered peoples and replace them with prisoners from other nations. It was clearly stated in God's covenant with His people that their disobedience would bring defeat and war. It would bring oppression and slavery, and it would finally bring captivity. And all of this happened to both Israel and Judah. The land belonged to the Lord. Not only was the land His, but so were the people. They would possess the land and enjoy its blessings as long as they kept the terms of the covenant. But repeated disobedience would bring discipline within the land and ultimately discipline outside the land. That's exactly what happened. Because of the people's sins during the period of the Judges, 7 different nations invaded the land, took the crops, and enslaved the people right in their own land. After the division of the nation, Israel was taken captive by Assyria, and Judah by Babylon. God kept the terms of His covenant. And if He did so then, don't you think He's going to do it again under the new covenant? In verses 7 through 17, we see that Israel disobeyed its law. These verses read like a legal court case against the northern kingdom of Israel. The law was a gift from God, an agreement that guaranteed His provision and protection if the people did His will. But they forgot how God had delivered them from Egypt and set them free. They ignored the law of Moses that commanded them not to worship false gods, but to destroy the heathen idols, temples, and shrines. Israel began with secret worship of idols in verse 9, but this eventually became public, and Jehovah was acknowledged as one God among many. The Lord sent prophets who admonished and warned the people, but the people paid little attention. As their ancestors had done so many times, the Jewish people stiffened their necks and hardened their hearts and refused to obey the Lord. Since we become like the God we worship, the people became as nothing because they worshipped vain idols. In fact, they turned to idols and made a golden calf while Moses was communing with God on Mount Sinai in Exodus 32. After the division of the kingdom, King Jeroboam made 2 golden calves for the people to worship, 1 Kings chapter 12. As is often the case, it is the children who suffer for the sins of the parents. For the Jewish fathers began to offer their sons and daughters on the fiery altars of the heathen gods. In verses 18 through 33, we see that Israel angered its Lord. The anger of the Lord is His holy wrath. It must not be compared to a child's temper tantrum. The Lord was long-suffering toward His people and made ample provision to bring them back to Himself, but they refused. God's wrath is anger motivated by love, which is anguish. It's the anguish of a father who wants the best for his children, but they prefer to go their own way. These verses inform us that the division of the kingdom into Judah and Israel was an act of God as he sought to protect David's dynasty from the idolatry in Israel. However, King Jeroboam's false man-made religion infected Judah, and it was only by the grace of God that a faithful remnant remained. The phrase, to fear the Lord, means to worship the Lord according to the law of Moses. The mixture of religions among the various peoples resulted in what we today would call pluralism. At first, the Jews didn't worship God at all, and he disciplined them for their unfaithfulness. Then they worshiped Jehovah plus the gods of the other nations. God will not share worship with false gods, so it's no wonder he became angry. All the people in the land should have repented, turned from their false gods, and turned to the Lord. But instead, the Lord's people accepted the false gods of other nations. The king of Assyria believed that each god was associated with the land from which the people came, and therefore the new residents didn't know how to worship the Lord of Israel. They could never learn from the Israelites left behind because they had been worshiping the golden calves since the days of King Jeroboam. The king of Assyria ordered one of the Jewish priests to be sent to Israel to teach the people how to worship the God of the land. But this priest went to Bethel, the site of one of the shrines dedicated to the golden calf. How much he knew about the true Jewish faith and what he taught aren't revealed to us, but the situation doesn't appear to be encouraging. Many people today would applaud this mixture of religions, but the Lord hates it. In a democracy, we learn to accept pluralism, but this doesn't mean we approve of it or believe that all religions are equal. In the United States, all religions are equal before the law and may be freely practiced, but Christians still believe that there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Acts 4 and verse 12. Jesus rejected the Samaritan religion because, as he said, salvation is of the Jews. John chapter 4, 19 through 24. The Jewish people who were left in the land appointed their own priests and ignored the standards established by God through Moses. The people set up their own religious ceremonies and integrated with this new system some of the beliefs of their new neighbors. There was something for everybody, and it didn't matter what you believed or how you worshiped, just as long as you were religious. Does this sound familiar? In verses 34 to 41, Israel did not learn her lesson. It's often been said that the one thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. In spite of the way the Lord had warned them and chastened them, the people continued to worship the Lord along with the other gods, and they did it their own way. They ignored their history as the people of God delivered from Egyptian bondage. They forgot God's laws and covenants, especially God's commandments concerning idolatry. Like many professed Christians today, the people of Israel worshiped the Lord where and how they pleased, but they also paid respect to the false gods of the other nations. What finally happened to these 10 disobedient tribes we hear about what finally happened to these 10 disobedient tribes? We hear about the 10 lost tribes of the peoples brought into the land by the Assyrians. And this produced the Samaritan people. But there's no evidence in Scripture that the 10 tribes of Israel are lost. Long before the Assyrians captured the northern kingdom, dedicated people from the 10 tribes moved to Judah and remained faithful to the Lord. Godly King Hezekiah invited true believers to come to Judah and worship God according to the Scriptures, and many of them came. 2 Chronicles 30. Josiah's reforms had a tremendous effect on the Jewish people, 2 Chronicles 34 and chapter 35. The main message from this tragic chapter is that false worship leads to corrupt practices, and corrupt practices result in divine condemnation and also divine judgment. Disobedient and compromising leaders, both kings and priests, failed to teach the people the Word of God. And as each new generation came along, the nation drifted further from the Lord. There came a day when God's anger was displayed against his people, and that was the end of the political entity known as Israel, the northern kingdom. We're going to stop at this point and pick up again in session 36. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.